Hello, I'm Bernard Hickey from interest.co.nz and welcome to a special report here from Parliament in Wellington, where we've just spoken to Bill English, the National Party's finance spokesman. If National wins the election, he will be the finance minister. And I asked him what about the Reserve Bank's policy targets agreement and how well it had performed in keeping inflation down, and also what he might do if he's finance minister. Do you think our monetary policy framework and the policy targets agreement that we have now is the right one, longer term?
Well, I think it's about as good as you can get. I've been part of the Select Committee inquiry into monetary policy, where we've talked to a number of monetary policy experts who I'd have to say shouldn't apply for night jobs as comedians. From that, though, it's pretty clear that around the world, the methods followed by reserve banks are pretty similar, regardless of how it's actually expressed. So we can change a few words here and there, but the current policy targets agreement is pretty balanced. I think the bigger issue is whether or not the 2% kind of inflation rates we had in the 90s were due to broader world circumstances, as much as very good inflation control. And looking ahead, are we going to see inflation lift to sort of 3 to 5% instead of 0 to 2%? Certainly from the way the Governor talked today, 3% looks more like his floor than his ceiling. I mean, he regards it as success if he can get down somewhere near that over the next 3 years. That's a pretty fundamental shift. I don't think anyone can accuse the Reserve Bank of overdoing it. He's allowing for a higher basic level of inflation, certainly than we would have thought was good for us 10 years ago.
Do you think that he's been soft on inflation?
I think he's just, I wouldn't so much say he's being soft. I think there's been a few mistakes made in recent years, particularly around housing, but and some of the signalling, the Reserve Bank Governor going out saying monetary policy doesn't work. Well, I think if you went to a household today, they can tell you it's working with a vengeance. That was always going to happen. I think we've got to be careful not to let the inflation genie out of the bottle, because fundamentally for a trading nation like New Zealand, too much inflation erodes the competitiveness of our export sector. And we cannot afford that when we need to be growing our export sector quite fast if we want to get sustainable high rates of growth, not letting the domestic sector eat it up. And probably where I think the Governor was a bit soft in his remarks today was around non-tradable inflation, essentially domestic inflation. It's been running at 4% for 6 years. And today he's telling us that it's suddenly going to turn down. Well, I think that's a pretty optimistic view. That 4% under the current policy settings look to me to be kind of built in. You know, it's about local body rates. It's about what's happened in the labour market. It looks pretty solid. And if your domestic inflation is running at 4%, it's hard to see how you're going to get total inflation down to 2%.
Do you think then that if he's saying 3% is the floor, that he may have failed to achieve his policy targets agreement?
Well, look, he didn't actually say it was the floor. I'm just suggesting that's how it looks, that the end result for them is to try and get inflation down a bit under 3%. Look, to be fair, the Governor's dealing with very difficult circumstances, and I think he's taking a pretty considered attitude. If he was going out there, if he went out and said, I'm going to kill off high oil prices and high food prices by sticking interest rates up, then he'd create a storm, and that would be out of line with where most central banks are going. So we've got to keep in mind the size of the inflation, or the size of the price shock that's hitting this economy. Something of the equivalent in the 70s brought a lot of Western economies to their knees. So it's pretty difficult, and I think if people just stay considered and don't worry themselves into paralysis, then we can get through this.
Because you have to wonder whether the policy targets agreement can work for what is not just a one-off shock, not just a 6-month thing, 4 years of higher oil prices. And as you say, maybe not 0 to 2, but 3 to 5 is more like what you could possibly achieve at best in the future. Do you think then that the policy targets agreement needs to reflect that?
No, look, I wouldn't change it. I mean, when the pressure's really on, is just the time when you need to keep the rules stable and credible in my view. There's some dispute, I think, over where the inflation track's going to go, and I think for instance, the expectation that interest rates might go from 8.25 down to 6 or something seems to me to be very optimistic. He might cut once or maybe twice. It's hard to see him tracking it right down to 6% because that inflation looks to me to be a bit more persistent than the governor is allowed to forecast. I mean, he always has to forecast that it's coming back within the band, and he's never done any differently. So he works back from the forecast.
See, that's just crazy to me. You've got someone being judged on their forecasts, not on their delivery.
Well, I think he is judged on the delivery, and under the circumstances, he's delivering something. He's actually not delivering. He's delivering fairly well. I was going to say he's not delivering too badly. I don't mean not delivering. He's not doing too badly. And if we want a yardstick, we should watch the Australians, because for quite a while we all thought the RBA had a better formula than New Zealand, but they really now have some real pressures in their economy, and their risks all on the upside. If they're not putting it up, it's because they thought of putting it up but didn't quite get round to it. They're trying to find reasons not to put their interest rates up. We're maybe a bit further through the cycle. Probably the worry about Australia and New Zealand is that we're headed to sub 1% growth. They're still running at 3% growth, and that's going to open the gap further.